Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to assemble the chassis for the little WPL truck. First then, we've got the dampers. Using the term very loosely of course. We'll need some plastic bits to build them. There's the 4 bodies and the top clips, 4 long springs. Then we've got the 4 shafts, which are basically just Phillips head screws with a really long shoulder. On the bottom there's the 4 rod ends. Now since these aren't really dampers, oil or otherwise, they're just a container for the springs, they're really easy to put together. We just pop one of the shafts down into the body and use a screwdriver to stop it spinning. Thread a rod end onto the end so it's covering up all of the thread. Drop a spring in through the top of the body so it sits on the screw head and clip one of the clips on the top. What you're left with is a perfectly functional widget to keep the axle sprung. Now we might change to some proper dampers later, but it'll be as much for looks as function. With 4 of those built up, we can move on to the chassis rails. In this step we're fitting some brass ball ends. There's a couple of different types in the kit. The ones we want for this bit are the ones with a short shoulder and a built-in M3 thread. In total we're going to need 7. To attach them, the kit includes some nice black M3 nylon nuts, of which we're going to need 7 of them too. 7 ball ends means the 2 halves are going to be sided, one with 4 balls and one with 3. The diagram is nice and clear where they should go, just make sure you've got a correct left and right side. These ball ends are for mounting the suspension links to, so at the rear there's a traditional 4-link setup, so we use 2 balls on each side. At the front though, we have a 3-link plus panhard bar, so we only need 3 of the balls on the chassis rails. As long as you match up with the diagram, you should be good to go. So with that little lot out of the way, we can start on the fun bit. Now they've overloaded this step just a little bit. It would have been a bit clearer if they'd split it up. It'll do though, and you can still work it out. We're going to need the gearbox, which is pre-built. Now I'm half tempted to take it apart, but I think it will be interesting to use it as it is and see how it runs. The whole thing is covered in a layer of grease, so I'm sure some of it must have made it inside. Maybe I'll pull it apart on a live stream over at twitch.tv/rcmojotv after it's been tested, just to see how it works. We also need the micro shift servo with its plastic bag of accessories, steering servo with its accessories, the front bumper, steering servo tray, the bumper mounts, and the rear cross member. First, because I don't want to make everything greasy, I'm going to give the gearbox a good wipe down. Everything in the bag that it came in was covered in grease too. I'm guessing at the station at the factory the assembler's hands were well coated, so it just kind of gets everywhere. First we'll set up the shift servo. Now its accessory pack comes with a very short self-tapper to keep the servo arm on, and 2 slightly bigger ones to attach the servo to the gearbox. Also there's a special black servo arm that acts as a cam to push the shift arm. Now we need to make sure the servo is in its centre position. We can hook up the radio gear and power it up with all the trim set to 0, or we can just use a servo tester. This one's my design, but even a basic one can be very helpful. We just need to set it to centre at 1500 microseconds and pop the servo cam on so it's pointing straight down. I'm a little dubious about this cam setup. I'm thinking it's going to load up the servo constantly in one of the gears, which isn't ideal. It's going to be pushing against that return spring all the time, but we'll try it and see how it goes. With the small screw screwed in to keep the cam on, we can offer the servo up to the gearbox, making sure the cam is sat in the slot in the nylon follower. Then the 2 self-tapper screws go in through the lugs on the servo to attach it to the gearbox. If we test the servo throw, you can see all the travel in one direction is wasted. In the other direction, it's using all of the travel. Having said that, the follower does appear to be moving all the way in, so it should be changing the gear okay. I'm thinking it's probably going to work, but not as well as it maybe could be. I think it's going to be a good candidate for some 3D printing. On the chassis rails we need to fit the dampers. These just attach to the outside with some washerhead self-tappers from the inside. It all ends up a bit wobbly and really they don't feel very nice at all. On the plus side, the holes in the bits that stick out on the chassis are perfectly positioned for some proper dampers. The other 3 fit in the same way. Just make sure for the rear ones you fit them to the rearmost holes. The steering servo fits directly into the tray that mounts to the front of the chassis. It's a huge step up from the old kits where you had to do your own thing, usually involving a Dremel and hot glue. Before we fit it though, we need to set it up. Just like the shift servo, we need to power it up and centre it. The servo comes with a nice oversized arm that we're going to use, and strangely it comes with a small self-tapper to attach it. It's strange because the servo has metal gears and the centre of the spline is tapped with an M3 thread. However, raiding my Tamiya fixings box, I found a nice M3x6 that'll be ideal. Now we just need to pop the arm on, which is extremely tight. I think they've ever so slightly undersized the arm. We can use the M3 screw to pull it on the rest of the way though, without damaging anything. If we test the servo now, you can hear it sounds very smooth and accurate, not jumpy with a huge deadband that a lot of cheap servos have. Now we can just drop the servo into its tray and use two washerhead self-tappers in the holes next to the lugs to attach it. The idea is that the washer on the screws overlaps the lugs and holds them in. A good plan, but they didn't quite get the dimensions right. If we push up on the servo arm, the servo pops out very easily. It's not a big deal though, we just need to use a couple of washers. These ones are sized for M3 threads. We'll pop one under each of the screws so they overlap the lugs properly. There we go, that's much better. That servo isn't going anywhere, and with no hot glue in sight. The last thing with the tray is we need to fit another one of the brass ball ends on the bottom for the panhard bar. Now I tried to screw it straight in, but it really wasn't having it. I ended up having to use an M3 tap to get the thread going. I didn't go all the way, just enough to give the thread a good start. Now the ball thread's in, but it's still stiff for the last turn or two, so it's not going to be coming loose anytime soon. Next we're going to fit the gearbox to the chassis. Now it uses 4 of the washerhead self-tappers in the endmost holes on the side of the gearbox. The strange part of this step is the size of the holes in the chassis rail. We won't do the screws up all the way just yet, just enough to take up the slack, but so the rails can still move. What's happened is whoever designed the 2-speed gearbox was either not told or forgot about the hole size. If we look at the tray that mounts to the old single-speed gearbox, you can see it's got little nubs that fill out the holes, taking out all the slop. Now it's not great, but for a lightweight 1/16 truck it's not really going to be the end of the world. We'll just leave the screws slightly loose until the other bits are on the chassis so we don't build in a twist. At the front we need to fit the servo tray, which does have little nubs. So we just slot it in and we can fit the 2 rearmost screws. The front 2 screws also need to pass through the bumper mounts, but first we need to mount the bumper mounts to the bumper. The ends of the mounts press into slots next to some screw holes, and we just use a couple of screws to attach them. However, even with the mount pressed in all the way, there's still a gap under the lug and the screw hole. If we fitted the screw as it is, it's going to pull the mounts together, which won't fit well at all. It's an easy fix though. The gap just happens to be about the same as those washers we use for the servo. So we'll just use a couple more of them to fill the gaps so the mount sits nice and straight. The other option of course would be to cut, grind or sand 0.5 millimeter off the end of the mounts so they can go in just that little bit further, but I think washers are easier. Now we just offer up the bumper assembly to the chassis and install 2 more screws. Now it's not perfect, but we have ended up with a fairly good fit. All the bumper parts are made from a flexible plastic, so it's actually going to make for a good bumper, more than just for looks. At the back we've got the rear crossmember, which again has little nubs to fill out the large holes. It fits with 4 more screws. However, it'll happily fit either way up, and the diagram isn't really clear enough to see which way is correct. To work it out, we can offer it up to the post it needs to locate on the bottom of the bed. The holes in the crossmember are slightly different sizes, top and bottom. The side that fits over the post ends up going on the top, which is the hollow side of the part. That means when we fit it to the chassis, we need the nice side with the WPL logo on the bottom. Pop in the 4 screws, and that's the chassis more or less done. We just need to nip up the 4 screws on the gearbox, while also gently pushing the gearbox upwards so we gain a little bit of extra ground clearance. It's only going to be 1 millimeter, but every little helps. With all the screws in, we've got a very stiff and hopefully straight chassis. Considering how little has really gone into it, I'm fairly impressed. The last little bit is to fit the cover that goes over the steering servo. We're going to be removing it again to fit the electronics, but we might as well fit it for now as it's going to help size things up and to see where the bits and bobs are going to fit. It just sits over the front and gets attached with 2 more screws. So there we go then, one WPL chassis complete. Quite nice for the amount that it costs, but not without its niggles. Impressions are generally quite positive though. If you got some pics or videos of your WPL build, why not join the Discord server? It's free to set up, just click on the invite in the description and off you go. So as always then, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!